They almost blocked him. Until the music spoke louder than words was a story that began quietly in a small, ordinary town where life moved slowly, and people rarely expected anything extraordinary to happen. And in that town there lived a young boy whose name was Daniel. And from a very early age, Daniel showed a deep connection to sound, rhythm, and melody. Long before he could properly speak, he reacted to music with unusual focus and emotion. And his parents noticed that whenever a song played, he became calm, alert, and expressive, as if the sounds were speaking directly to him. And as he grew older, this connection only became stronger and more visible to those around him. Daniel did not come from a wealthy family, and his parents worked long hours to provide basic comfort and stability. But despite their exhaustion, they always supported their son and encouraged his interest in music, even when others saw it as a distraction or an unrealistic dream. And when Daniel was still very young, he found an old piano in a local community hall. The keys were worn and some notes sounded uneven, yet to Daniel, it felt alive and meaningful. And he spent hours sitting beside it, touching the keys slowly, listening carefully, and trying to understand how different sounds connected with each other. And although he had no formal training at first, he learned by observation, memory, and feeling, and the music he created was simple but honest and full of emotion, and the people who happened to hear him play sometimes stopped and listened without realizing why they felt moved. And as years passed, Daniel grew into a quiet, thoughtful child who expressed himself more easily through music than through words. And at school he struggled to fit in because his focus was different from others, and some teachers viewed his passion as a problem rather than a gift, and they encouraged him to focus on practical subjects instead of spending time on music. And his classmates often misunderstood him and considered him strange or distant, yet Daniel remained gentle, patient, and determined, and he continued to practice whenever he could, even if it meant waking up early or staying late. And music became his safe place, his language, and his way of understanding the world. And his parents did their best to protect his spirit, but they also worried about his future, because they knew the world could be harsh toward those who followed unconventional paths. And one day an opportunity appeared that could change everything. A local cultural event announced a public performance where young talents could showcase their skills, and it was meant to be a chance for recognition, encouragement, and possible mentorship. And Daniel felt a strong pull toward this event, as if something inside him knew this moment mattered. And his parents hesitated at first because they feared rejection, disappointment, and judgment, but they eventually agreed because they believed in their son and wanted him to have a chance. And as the day approached, Daniel practiced with quiet intensity, pouring his emotions, hopes, and fears into every note. And he imagined standing in front of an audience not to impress them, but to share something real and meaningful. And when the day finally arrived, the hall was filled with people, judges, organizers, and participants, and the atmosphere was tense and expectant. And Daniel walked in, holding himself with calm determination, though his heart was beating fast. And when his name was called, he stepped forward toward the piano, unaware that this moment would test his resilience and shape his future in ways he could not imagine. When Daniel stepped closer to the piano, the weight of the room pressed against him in a way he had never felt before. And although he had played in public spaces many times, this moment felt different because it carried expectations, judgment, and rules that did not exist when he played alone. And the organizers watched him carefully, whispering among themselves as they checked lists and schedules. And one of them noticed his age and simple appearance and quietly questioned whether he belonged in this event at all. And Daniel sensed the hesitation in their eyes, even though no one spoke directly to him yet, and this silent doubt made his chest tight, but he stayed calm because music had taught him how to remain steady even when emotions tried to take control. And as he sat on the bench, he noticed that the piano was newer than the one he practiced on, and the keys felt smoother, colder, and less familiar. And for a brief moment, uncertainty crept into his mind as he wondered if he would be able to connect with this instrument the same way he connected with the old worn piano that had shaped his learning. And while he adjusted his posture, one of the judges leaned forward and asked him where he had studied music. And when Daniel answered honestly that he had never attended a formal music school, the judge exchanged looks with the others, and their expressions shifted subtly toward doubt and mild concern. And another judge asked if he could read sheet music, and Daniel replied softly that he played by memory and feeling. And this response created a noticeable change in the atmosphere, because the event was designed to highlight trained talent and structured performances. And Daniel did not fit neatly into that expectation, and the organizers stepped aside for a brief discussion. And Daniel waited silently, his hands resting on his lap, while his parents watched from the back of the room, holding their breath and hoping for understanding and acceptance. And after a moment, one of the organizers returned and spoke politely but firmly, explaining that the program was full and that priority was given to participants with formal training and prepared documentation. And although his tone was respectful, the message was clear. And Daniel felt a quiet heaviness settle inside him as he realized he might not even be allowed to play a single note. And his parents felt a sharp pain of disappointment and frustration because they had seen how deeply their son connected with music and how much effort he had put into preparing for this day. And they wanted to speak up, but they also did not want to create conflict or embarrassment for Daniel. And Daniel himself remained composed even though his heart felt heavy, and he nodded slowly, acknowledging the decision, and began to stand up, ready to accept the rejection with dignity and walk away without protest. And as he turned slightly toward his parents, they saw the calm sadness in his eyes, and it was that expression that moved something inside the room. And before he could take another step, an older man sitting among the judges raised his hand gently and asked for a moment. and his voice carried a calm authority that drew attention. And he said that while rules were important, so was the purpose of the event, which was to discover genuine talent and expression. And he suggested that allowing the boy to play for just a short time would not disrupt the program and could only add value, and the room fell quiet as the organizers considered his words, and some looked uncertain while others seemed mildly annoyed, but eventually they agreed reluctantly and told Daniel he could play one short piece, and that it would not affect the official evaluations, and Daniel listened carefully and nodded with gratitude because even a brief chance meant everything to him. And he returned to the bench, slowly placing his hands on the keys and closing his eyes for a moment to steady his breathing. And as he did this, the noise of the room faded in his mind, and he focused inward, recalling the feeling of the old piano, the quiet hours of practice, and the emotions he had poured into music during moments of joy, loneliness, and hope. And when he opened his eyes again, his expression had changed from uncertainty to quiet resolve, and his fingers hovered above the keys, ready to speak the language that had always understood him even when people did not. As Daniel lowered his hands onto the piano keys, the room remained still. But the stillness was not warm or encouraging. It was filled with uncertainty, curiosity, and restrained judgment, and many people in the audience expected hesitation or a simple, unremarkable attempt, because they had already formed opinions based on his background and lack of formal training. And the first sound that emerged from the piano was soft and controlled, not loud or dramatic, yet it immediately carried a sense of intention and honesty, and Daniel did not rush, because he was not trying to impress anyone. He was trying to express something real that lived inside him, and his fingers moved naturally across the keys, guided by memory, emotion, and instinct rather than written notes. And as the melody unfolded, it became clear that this was not a practiced performance meant to follow rules, but a personal story shaped by years of quiet listening and feeling. And the music carried moments of gentleness, tension, sadness, and hope woven together in a way that felt deeply human. And as the sound filled the hall, people began to shift in their seats without realizing why, because something about the music reached past their expectations and spoke directly to their emotions, and even those who had doubted him felt their focus narrow as they listened more closely. And the judges who had questioned his place on the stage slowly leaned forward, their expressions changing from polite observation to genuine attention. And Daniel himself was fully immersed in the moment, unaware of the eyes watching him, because when he played music, the outside world often disappeared, and he felt safe, free, and understood. And the piano responded to his touch in a way that surprised him, as if it recognized his sincerity and allowed him to shape the sound freely. And the melody grew stronger, not louder but deeper and more confident. And it reflected the journey he had lived through, moments of being overlooked, misunderstood, and quietly determined. And his parents watched with tears forming in their eyes, because they recognized pieces of their son's life in every movement and every shift in tone, and they saw how music allowed him to say what he could never fully explain in words. And the audience, who had come expecting polished technical performances, now found themselves emotionally engaged in something raw and unfiltered. And the room felt different because the music had changed the energy and softened the rigid structure that had defined the event. And some people closed their eyes as they listened, while others watched Daniel's hands move with surprising grace and control. And when the final notes gently faded, the silence that followed was no longer tense, but heavy with emotion and reflection. And Daniel slowly lifted his hands and sat still, unsure of what the reaction would be, because he had played from the heart, not knowing how that would be judged. And for a brief moment, no one spoke or moved. And then the older judge who had defended him earlier exhaled deeply, as if releasing something he had been holding, and the sound of applause began quietly from a few individuals before spreading across the hall and growing stronger and more sincere. And Daniel looked up, surprised, because he had not expected response, and the applause was not loud out of excitement, but steady and meaningful, as if people were acknowledging something important that had just been shared. And the organizers exchanged looks that revealed discomfort mixed with realization, because the performance had challenged their assumptions and rules. And while some judges still held on to their standards, others felt a shift in perspective as they recognized that talent did not always follow traditional paths. And Daniel stood slowly and bowed slightly, not out of formality but out of respect and gratitude. And as he stepped away from the piano, he felt a quiet sense of peace regardless of what the final outcome would be, because he had been allowed to speak in the one language that had always been true to him. And in that moment, he understood that even if doors remained closed, the music itself had already spoken louder than words. After the applause faded, the room slowly returned to motion, but something within it had clearly changed, and the formal structure that once felt rigid now seemed slightly unsettled, as people adjusted their thoughts and reactions. And Daniel stepped back toward his parents, who reached out instinctively, placing gentle hands on his shoulders, not speaking, but communicating pride, relief, and deep emotion through their touch. And the organizers asked the audience to settle, as the event needed to continue, yet their voices no longer carried the same certainty as before. And while other performers prepared for their turns, quiet conversations spread hall as people shared their impressions and tried to describe what they had felt while listening to Daniel. And many struggled to find the right words, because the experience had been personal and unexpected. And among the judges there was clear division, as some maintained that rules existed for a reason, and that emotional response alone should not outweigh technical standards, while others felt strongly that what they had witnessed was rare and meaningful and deserved recognition beyond the limitations of the program. And the older judge who had spoken earlier remained thoughtful, observing the reactions of his colleagues, and noting the way the audience still glanced toward Daniel with curiosity and respect. And as the event moved forward, Daniel sat quietly beside his parents watching other performances with calm focus and genuine appreciation, because he loved music in all its forms and never felt threatened by others' talents, yet inside him there was uncertainty, because he did not know whether the moment he had shared would lead to anything or simply fade once the event ended, and his parents shared that uncertainty, feeling both grateful for the opportunity he had been given and anxious about the possible outcome, because they knew how easily institutions could return to routine and dismiss what did not fit established expectations. And as the final performance ended and the judges gathered to deliberate, the atmosphere grew heavy again, but this time it was filled with anticipation rather than tension, and the audience waited quietly, sensing that something important was unfolding behind closed doors. And during the discussion, the judges reviewed scores, notes, and criteria, yet Daniel's name kept returning to the conversation, because his performance could not be measured in the same way as the others. And this created discomfort for those who valued structure, but also sparked curiosity among those who believed that art required flexibility and openness. And one judge argued that allowing emotion to override formal training could undermine the integrity of the program, while another responded that ignoring raw ability and authentic expression could cause them to miss exceptional talent. And the discussion grew more intense as they questioned the purpose of the event, and whether it existed to reward preparation or to discover voices that had not yet been shaped by institutions. And the older judge listened carefully and then spoke calmly, reminding them that history was filled with artists who were once dismissed because they did not fit existing frameworks, and that their role was not only to judge, but to recognize potential and nurture it responsibly. And his words carried weight because of his experience and reputation. And slowly the tone of the discussion shifted from resistance to consideration. And while not all judges agreed, they acknowledged that Daniel's performance had left a lasting impact on the room and could not simply be ignored, and they reached a compromise, deciding that while he might not fit the competitive categories, he deserved acknowledgement, support, and an opportunity to grow and share his talent further. And when the judges returned to the hall, the audience sensed the change and leaned forward, listening closely, as the lead organizer addressed the room and spoke about the importance of discipline, training, and dedication, while also emphasizing the value of genuine expression and emotional connection. And then he called Daniel's name again, and Daniel stood slowly, feeling a mix of hope and caution, because he did not want to assume anything. And as he walked forward, the organizer explained that although the program had strict guidelines, they had witnessed something unique and meaningful, and that they wished to offer Daniel mentorship, access to formal training resources, and an invitation to perform at future events. And the audience responded with warm, supportive applause that felt different from before, because it carried affirmation rather than surprise, and Daniel listened carefully, processing every word as he realized that although he had not been blocked entirely, the path ahead would still require effort, discipline, and adaptation. And he felt grateful, not because doors had suddenly opened, but because he had been seen and heard on his own terms. And his parents stood behind him, overwhelmed with emotion, because they understood how significant it was for their son to be recognized without being forced to abandon his identity. And as Daniel thanked the judges quietly, his voice steady but soft, he expressed his appreciation for the opportunity and his willingness to learn, grow, and respect the craft of music, while staying true to what guided him. And his words were simple yet sincere, and they resonated with the room because they reflected humility rather than entitlement. And as the event concluded and people began to leave, several audience members approached Daniel and his parents, offering encouragement, kind words, and personal reflections about how the music had affected them. And these interactions reinforced the idea that the performance had created real connection beyond the stage. And as they stepped outside into the evening air, Daniel felt both exhausted and light, as if something heavy had been lifted and replaced with quiet confidence. And he did not feel victorious in a dramatic sense, but he felt validated in a deeper way, because he had learned that staying true to his voice did not mean rejecting growth, but trusting that authenticity had a place even in structured spaces. And as they walked home together, his parents spoke gently about lessons, schedules, and responsibilities, but also reminded him that what mattered most was preserving the joy and honesty that had shaped his music from the beginning. And Daniel listened thoughtfully, aware that this moment was not an ending but a transition, and that the road ahead would bring new challenges, expectations, and pressures. Yet he also knew that as long as he remained connected to the reason he began playing in the first place, the music would continue to guide him even when words failed. And in that understanding, he felt calm, prepared, and quietly hopeful about what was to come in the weeks that followed the event. Daniel's life began to change in quiet but meaningful ways. And although there was no sudden fame or dramatic transformation, there was a noticeable shift in how people around him viewed his presence and potential. And the mentorship opportunity offered by the judges soon became real, as Daniel was introduced to a small group of experienced musicians who approached teaching not as a rigid system but as a process of guidance and discovery. And from the first meeting, Daniel felt both excited and nervous, because he had always learned alone, and now he was entering a structured environment where expectations existed and rules mattered. And yet the mentors surprised him by listening first before instructing, and they asked him to play freely without correction, simply observing how he connected with the instrument and how he shaped sound and emotion. And this approach helped Daniel feel respected rather than judged, and allowed trust to form naturally. And his parents noticed this change and felt relief, because they had worried that formal training might suppress the honesty that made his music special. But instead it seemed to expand his understanding while preserving his identity. And as lessons continued, Daniel was introduced to musical theory, technique, and discipline not as limitations, but as tools that could help him express his ideas more clearly and with greater control. And although some concepts were challenging at first, he approached them with patience because his love for music motivated him to learn rather than resist, and he began to understand how structure could support creativity rather than replace it. And this realization marked an important step in his growth, because it helped him balance instinct with knowledge and emotion with intention. And outside the practice room, his daily life slowly reflected this new balance, as he became more confident in school and more open in social situations. And while he still preferred quiet observation to loud interaction, he no longer felt invisible or uncertain about his worth, and some teachers who had once discouraged his focus on music began to show interest in his progress and offered support that felt sincere rather than obligatory. And although not everyone understood his journey, he learned that understanding was not required for validation and that staying consistent mattered more than seeking approval. And during this time, Daniel was invited to perform again at a smaller community gathering organized by one of his mentors. And unlike the previous event, this performance was not competitive and carried no pressure of judgment, which allowed him to play with openness and calm. And the audience responded warmly and attentively, and Daniel felt a deeper connection than before because he was no longer proving anything, he was simply sharing. And this experience reinforced the idea that music did not need permission to exist, and that meaningful expression often thrived in spaces free from comparison and expectation. And as months passed, Daniel continued to grow both technically and emotionally, and he faced moments of frustration when progress felt slow or when lessons challenged habits he had developed on his own. But he learned to sit with that discomfort rather than avoid it, and his mentors encouraged reflection, patience, and curiosity, reminding him that growth was rarely linear, and that setbacks were not signs of failure, but invitations to deepen understanding. And this guidance helped Daniel develop resilience and perspective that extended beyond music and into how he approached life and relationships. And his parents watched this transformation with gratitude and humility, aware that their role was shifting from protectors to supporters, and they focused on creating stability and encouragement while allowing Daniel to navigate his own path. And although financial strain remained a concern, the community support that emerged after the event helped ease some of the burden through scholarships, shared resources, and informal assistance. And this collective response reminded Daniel and his family that connection and generosity often followed authenticity and sincerity. And as Daniel looked back on the moment when he had nearly been blocked from playing, he no longer felt bitterness or resentment, because he understood that the resistance had revealed something important about both himself and the world, and it had taught him that systems often struggled to recognize what did not conform, yet that truth had a way of making itself known through persistence and clarity. And music had been his voice when words were insufficient, and that voice had carried him forward not by force but by presence and intention. And as he continued to practice day after day, he remained grounded in the simple joy that had first drawn him to the piano, and he reminded himself that recognition was not the goal but a byproduct, and that the real purpose was to remain honest, curious, and open to learning. And with that understanding, Daniel stepped into the next chapter of his journey not with certainty, but with trust, knowing that while the path ahead would hold challenges, the music would continue to guide him and speak on his behalf whenever doubt returned. And in that quiet confidence, he found strength, direction, and a sense of belonging that no barrier could truly take away. As time moved forward, Daniel began to experience the realities that came with growing visibility and responsibility. And while opportunities slowly increased, so did expectations from others and from himself. And this new phase required adjustment, because the freedom he once had while playing alone was now accompanied by schedules, feedback, and performance goals. And although he welcomed growth, he sometimes felt pressure to meet standards that were unfamiliar and demanding, and there were days when practice heavy rather than joyful, and moments when he questioned whether he could maintain his authenticity while adapting to professional guidance. And during those times, he returned to the quiet habits that had always grounded him, such as playing softly late in the evening or experimenting with melodies without structure, simply to reconnect with why he began. And these private moments helped him release tension and restore balance, and his mentors noticed when he seemed overwhelmed and responded with patience, reminding him that progress did not require constant intensity, and that rest, reflection, and emotional honesty were just as important as discipline and technique. And this reassurance helped Daniel learn how to manage pressure without allowing it to control him, and gradually he developed the ability to separate external expectations from internal purpose. And this skill became essential as he was invited to perform in more formal settings where audiences were larger and reactions were more visible. And in these environments, he learned to stay present and focused rather than distracted by judgment or comparison. And each performance taught him something new about connection, vulnerability, and trust. And while some audiences responded more openly than others, Daniel remained consistent because he understood that his role was not to control reactions, but to offer sincerity and effort, and this mindset protected him from discouragement and allowed him to grow steadily without losing direction. And at home, his parents continued to provide emotional stability even when they did not fully understand the technical aspects of his training, and their belief in him remained constant and unconditional, which gave Daniel a sense of safety that allowed him to take risks and accept criticism without fear of losing support. And this foundation became increasingly important as Daniel entered a stage where decisions about future paths began to surface and conversations about education, career, and long-term became more frequent. And while the future remained uncertain, Daniel felt less afraid of it because he had learned through experience that uncertainty did not mean failure but possibility. And he approached these discussions with openness, rather than resistance, expressing his willingness to work hard while staying connected to what felt meaningful, and this honest communication strengthened trust between him and those guiding him. And as he reflected on how far he had come, Daniel recognized that the moment when he was nearly turned away had shaped his resilience more than any success could have, and it had taught him how to remain steady in the face of doubt, and how to speak through action rather than argument, and this lesson stayed with him as he continued forward, reminding him that being heard was not always about being loud, but about being true and consistent. And in that understanding, Daniel carried his music with quiet confidence, allowing it to continue speaking on his behalf wherever words might fall short. As Daniel grew older, the contrast between his early uncertainty and his developing confidence became more visible not only to others, but to himself, and he began to recognize patterns in his journey that helped him navigate new situations with clarity and calm. And one of the most important changes was his relationship with failure, which once felt threatening, but now felt informative and manageable. And when a performance did not go as planned, or when feedback highlighted areas that needed improvement, he no longer internalized it as rejection, but viewed it as guidance that could strengthen his craft, and this shift allowed him to stay motivated without becoming defensive or discouraged. And his mentors encouraged this mindset by sharing their own experiences of struggle, doubt, and slow progress. And these conversations helped Daniel understand that growth was rarely immediate, and that mastery was built through patience, repetition, and honest reflection. And as his skill developed, he began composing his own pieces that reflected personal experiences, emotions, and observations. And these compositions became a new form of expression that allowed him to process change, responsibility, and identity. And while he still valued guidance, he also learned to trust his instincts and make creative decisions independently, and this balance between learning and self-direction gave him a sense of ownership over his work, and strengthened his commitment to music as a long-term path. And beyond music, Daniel became more aware of the people around him and how his story affected them, and younger students began approaching him with curiosity, admiration, and questions. And he responded with humility, sharing encouragement rather than advice, because he remembered how isolating it felt to be misunderstood, and he wanted others to feel supported rather than judged. And this role quietly reinforced his sense of purpose, because he realized that his journey had value beyond personal achievement and could inspire others to remain patient and honest in their own pursuits. And as he reflected on the title moment when he was almost blocked, he understood that it had not only tested his talent, but also his character, and that staying calm, respectful, and sincere in that situation had opened doors that force or anger never could. And this awareness shaped how he approached challenges going forward, because he learned that consistency, integrity, and quiet confidence often spoke louder than explanation or persuasion. And as Daniel continued walking his path, he did so with grounded determination, knowing that while recognition might come and go, the deeper reward was staying aligned with what felt true and meaningful. And that understanding continued to guide his choices both in music and in life. As Daniel's journey continued, he reached a stage where his music began to travel beyond the familiar spaces of his community and mentors, and he was invited to participate in regional events, workshops, and collaborative projects that exposed him to different styles, perspectives, and expectations. And these experiences broadened his understanding of music as a shared language rather than a solitary pursuit. And while adapting to new environments required effort, he approached each opportunity with curiosity and respect, listening closely to others and learning from both harmony and difference. And this openness helped him grow not only as a musician, but as a person capable of empathy and cooperation. And through collaboration, he learned how to balance his own voice with the presence of others, recognizing when to lead and when to support. And this awareness strengthened his confidence without diminishing his humility. And at times, he encountered skepticism from those who measured talent through conventional credentials. And while such encounters still stirred discomfort, they no longer defined his sense of worth, because he had learned that validation rooted in self-understanding was more stable than external approval. And during moments of doubt, he reflected on the early days when he played simply because it felt necessary and grounding. And that memory reminded him that his relationship with music was not dependent on acceptance or recognition. And this perspective allowed him to remain steady even when faced with comparison, competition, or indifference. And as he continued performing and learning, he began to notice how audiences responded differently to authenticity, and how moments of sincerity often created deeper connection than technical perfection. And this observation reinforced his belief that music was not only about skill, but about presence, honesty, and emotional clarity. And while he continued refining his technique, he never allowed it to replace intention, and this balance became a defining element of his style and identity. And as he looked ahead, Daniel understood that his path would continue to evolve and that challenges would remain a constant part of growth. But he no longer feared them because he trusted his ability to adapt, learn, and remain true to himself. And in that trust, he found stability, purpose, and quiet confidence, knowing that whatever spaces he entered, his music would continue to speak for him with clarity, sincerity, and strength, even when words were unnecessary or insufficient. As Daniel approached a turning point in his journey, he began to reflect more deeply on what success truly meant to him. And this reflection was shaped by years of experience, growth, and quiet observation rather than sudden achievement or public praise, and he realized that success was not defined by how many people recognized his name or how often he performed, but by how honestly he could remain connected to his purpose and values. And this understanding influenced the choices he made as new opportunities appeared, some promising visibility, but requiring compromise, while others offered slower growth with greater freedom. And Daniel learned to evaluate these paths, carefully guided by intuition and thoughtful discussion with those he trusted. And this process strengthened his sense of agency and responsibility, because he understood that every decision shaped not only his career but his relationship with music itself. And during this time he experienced moments of loneliness as well, because growth often created distance from familiar routines and relationships. And while new environments brought learning, they also required letting go of certain comforts and expectations. And Daniel allowed himself to feel this loss without resisting it, because he understood that change was part of any meaningful journey. And he used these emotions as inspiration, returning to composition and reflection as ways of processing transition and uncertainty. And through this practice, his music gained depth and maturity, reflecting not just passion but understanding and lived experience. And those who listened noticed this evolution, sensing a quiet strength beneath the sound that came from resilience rather than ambition. And as Daniel continued forward, he felt less driven by the need to prove himself and more guided by a desire to contribute something honest and lasting. And this shift brought peace, because it freed him from comparison and allowed him to move at his own pace. And in this stage of his life, Daniel no longer feared being blocked or overlooked, because he trusted that staying aligned with his truth would always lead him where he needed to be, even if the path unfolded slowly and without certainty. And with that trust, he carried himself forward, steady, open, prepared for whatever the next chapter would bring, knowing that the music would continue to guide and speak for him as it always had. As Daniel moved into the next phase of his life, the lessons he had gathered began to settle into something steady and enduring. And he no longer viewed his journey as a struggle against barriers, but as an ongoing conversation between patience, effort, and belief. And he understood now that being almost blocked had never been the end of the story, but the moment that revealed his strength and direction. And when he looked back at that day, he felt gratitude rather than pain, because it had taught him how to stand calmly in uncertainty and let his actions speak honestly. And as new challenges appeared, he met them with the same quiet resolve, trusting that consistency would carry him forward even when progress felt slow or unseen. And those around him began to recognize not just his talent but his character and reliability, and this respect opened doors naturally without force or demand. And Daniel continued to grow not by chasing recognition, but by remaining devoted to learning, sharing, and listening, and his music reflected this maturity, carrying warmth, clarity, and intention that resonated deeply with those who heard it. And as he stepped into future opportunities, he did so without fear of being silenced, because he knew now that his voice did not depend on permission, and that music, when rooted in truth, would always find a way to be heard. And in this understanding, Daniel found fulfillment not in the absence of obstacles, but in the confidence that whatever stood in his way, the music would continue to speak louder than words. As Daniel reached a place of deeper understanding, he no longer measured his life by milestones or approval, but by alignment with the values that had quietly shaped him from the beginning. And this sense of alignment brought calm even when circumstances remained uncertain, and he understood that the journey he had taken was not about proving worth, but about honoring the connection he felt to music and to himself. And with this clarity, he stepped into adulthood with humility and confidence, aware that growth would continue to demand effort, patience, and self-honesty. And he welcomed that reality rather than fearing it. And as he continued to perform, teach, and create, he noticed how his presence alone often reassured others who were struggling to trust their own voices. And without intention, he became a symbol of quiet persistence and sincerity. And this role carried responsibility, which he accepted, thoughtfully choosing to lead by example rather than instruction. And when people asked about his past, he spoke openly, not with drama, but with reflection, sharing that the moment he was almost turned away had taught him the importance of staying grounded and respectful even when misunderstood. And he emphasized that resilience was not about resisting systems, but about remaining true within them, and when possible, helping them evolve. And this perspective shaped how he interacted with institutions, audiences, and collaborators, and allowed him to move with integrity across different spaces and expectations. Music remained at the center of his life, not as an escape, but as a companion that helped him process change and connect with others. And he continued to return to the piano not only to perform, but to listen and reflect and remind himself of the quiet beginnings that had carried him forward. And in those moments he felt gratitude for every obstacle, because each one had refined his understanding and strengthened his resolve. And as years passed, Daniel came to accept that being blocked at times was part of any meaningful path, and that what mattered most was how one responded with patience, humility, and consistency. And he carried this lesson forward into every chapter, knowing that while doors might close, the truth expressed through honest work would always find a way through. And with this understanding, Daniel lived not in fear of being silenced, but in trust that the music he carried would continue to speak clearly and powerfully long after words had faded. And in that trust he found peace, purpose, and a sense of belonging that no barrier could ever take away.